నమస్కారం. నా ఈ ప్రయత్నం మీకు నచ్చినట్లయితే గనక మన ఛానల్‌ని సబ్స్క్రైబ్ చేసుకొని, పై జాబితాలోని మరిన్ని వీడియోలను చూడటం ద్వారా మీ నైపుణ్యాలను, జ్ఞానాన్ని కూడా అభివృద్ధి చేసుకోవడానికి ప్రయత్నించండి. జై హింద్. Please subscribe for more videos. Thank you.
Pawns working together can be an unstoppable force. One of the most powerful pawn formations is the pawn chain. A pawn chain is a group of pawns placed on the same diagonal, where each pawn protects the pawn diagonally in front of it. We call this line of pawns a pawn chain because the pawns are linked together. Look at White's powerful pawn chain in this position, starting from a2 and going up the board all the way to d5. It is very difficult to attack these pawns, as the only weakness in a pawn chain is its base, the only pawn that isn't protected by another pawn, in this case, the a2 pawn. Notice that these pawns control key squares, making it very difficult for Black's light-squared bishop to find good squares to use. When a pawn chain starts moving, look out. In this position, watch how these pawns march up the board, each taking turns protecting one another. After b5, king b7, d7, White is already threatening to promote this pawn into a queen on the next turn. Black prevents this with king c7, and now White plays c6, protecting the pawn on d7, and the pawn chain marches forward. After king d8, White plays b6. The mobile pawn chain marches forward, forcing Black's king off the back rank. After king e7, b7, Black cannot stop White from promoting the pawn into a queen on the next turn. After king d8, b8 equals queen, check. Black's king was no match for White's mobile pawn chain. Do not underestimate the strength of a pawn chain. Even two pawns connected as a pawn chain can outpower a piece as strong as a rook. In this position, Black attacks the pawn on b7 with rook b8. Is White's pawn doomed? Not if White plays a6, forming a pawn chain that will overpower Black's rook. After king f8, White advances the a-pawn with a7, and Black cannot stop White from promoting. Let's take a look at two choices. If Black captures the pawn on b7 with rook takes b7, White simply promotes to a queen and forks the king and rook with a8 equals queen. What if Black doesn't capture the b7 pawn, but moves the rook to safety with rook d8? White now advances one of the pawns into a queen, let's say b8 equals queen, and after rook takes b8, White's second pawn recaptures the rook and promotes into a queen with a takes b8 equals queen. Two powerful pawns overwhelm the Black rook. What happens when both sides have pawn chains? Look at this position. White has a healthy pawn chain from f4 to g5 to h6, and Black has a pawn chain on h7 to g6 to f5. How can either side attack these strong pawn chains? Remember, a pawn chain's weakest point is the first pawn in the chain, known as the base of the pawn chain. Since the base isn't protected by a pawn, this is a target to attack. Notice the base of White's pawn chain is f4, protected by White's king. The base of Black's pawn chain, h7, does not have any protection, so White plays bishop to g8. Black is helpless in preventing White's bishop from capturing all of Black's pawns. Let's take a look at one more position together. It is not always practical to attack the base of the pawn chain. Sometimes you have to challenge the pawn chain head-on. In this position, notice Black has a strong pawn chain, b7, c6, d5, e4. White attacks the head of the pawn chain with f3. If Black does nothing, White will win the pawn on e4 on the next move, as the f3 pawn joins both the knight and the queen in attacking the e4 square. Black only has two defenders, the d5 pawn and the f6 knight. After e takes f3, Black's pawn chain is shortened, and the head of the pawn chain is no longer taking space in White's territory. After bishop takes f3, White captures the pawn and places pressure on Black's new head of the pawn chain, d5. Now it's your turn to practice attacking with in defending against pawn chains.